It was supposed to be an ordinary night, the kind of night when nothing out of the ordinary happens. The moon hung heavy in the sky, casting its pale light through the window. The world outside was quiet, too quiet, almost as if holding its breath. I sat alone in my room, flicking through a dusty box of old video games I had found in my parents' attic. The box was a relic, one of those forgotten treasures that had accumulated over the years, sitting idle until curiosity led me to sift through it. Inside were a variety of games, most of which I had no memory of, or at least no interest in. But one game stood out to me. It was an old, nondescript disc with no label, just a faded design scratched across its surface. The kind of thing you'd expect to find tucked away in the far corner of some long-forgotten box. The title, written in an elegant but disturbing font, read, "The Game You Can't Escape." The name alone was unsettling. It was as if it was warning me, but I ignored the unease in my stomach and popped the disc into my computer. The screen flickered as the game loaded. It was unlike anything I'd ever seen before. The graphics were outdated, almost primitive, but there was something strange about the way the game world felt alive. It was as though the very air in the game itself was waiting for something, just on the cusp of revealing its secrets. I sat there, fingers hovering over the keyboard, unsure whether to press start or leave the game untouched. The longer I stared at the screen, the more the images seemed to bleed together, shapes distorting as if beckoning me to play. What else could I do? I clicked start, and the game began. The story was simple, almost too simple. You played as a nameless character, stranded in a dark, abandoned house with no memory of how you got there. There were eerie, atmospheric sounds, creaking floorboards, distant whispers, and the occasional thud that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand on end. At first, the gameplay was mundane, walking through empty hallways, picking up objects that did nothing. But there was a growing sense of dread that followed me as I explored. I should have quit then. I should have stopped, closed the game, and turned off my computer. But something about it, I couldn't stop playing. I ventured into the main room of the house. The walls were covered with strange symbols I couldn't understand. The furniture was old and rotting, just like the rest of the place. In the center of the room was a table, and sitting on the table was a wooden box. Without thinking, I clicked on it, and the screen flickered as the box opened. Inside was a note. It read, "The game only ends when you understand the rules." As soon as I read the words, my screen went black. My heart pounded in my chest. I thought it was a glitch. But then the game loaded again, this time with a new environment. The house was gone. Instead, I was standing in a forest, the trees towering over me like dark sentinels. The air was thick with fog, and the sky overhead was a strange, unnatural shade of gray. My character moved automatically, as though guided by something unseen. I tried to pause the game, but the keyboard was unresponsive. The game had control now, and I didn't understand the rules. I walked deeper into the forest, the crunch of dead leaves beneath my feet the only sound. There were no enemies, no visible threats, just the eerie silence of the trees. But then, as I turned a corner, I saw something in the distance. A figure standing motionless in the fog. It was tall, slender, and wearing a dark cloak that seemed to blend into the shadows. I froze, my heart in my throat. The figure didn't move. It didn't speak. It was just there watching. I couldn't take my eyes off it, and neither could my character. It was as if the game was forcing me to look at it. Every instinct told me to run, to escape, but my body wouldn't obey. Suddenly, the figure spoke, its voice a whisper that seemed to emanate from the very fog itself. "You should not have played." Before I could react, the game screen flickered again, and the figure disappeared. I was back in the dark house, standing in front of the same wooden table. But this time, the box was gone. In its place was a note, hastily scrawled. "Now you are part of the game." I leaned back in my chair, heart racing. A chill ran down my spine. My thoughts were clouded. Was it just a game? Was it a prank? Or was something more sinister at play here? The whispers from the game began to bleed into my surroundings. I turned off the screen and sat in the dark, trying to shake off the eerie feeling that had settled in my bones. But the whispers didn't stop. They echoed in my head, growing louder, more insistent. My phone buzzed in my pocket. I pulled it out, half expecting a message from my friend, Jack, who had been texting me earlier. But no, there was no message. Just a new notification. You can't escape the game. It plays you now. I felt the blood drain from my face. Who could have sent that? The game was no longer just confined to the screen. It was reaching into my reality, twisting everything I thought I knew. I looked around, half expecting to see shadows move in the corners of my room. The game wasn't over. It wasn't just a game. It was something much worse, something real. And as the night dragged on, I realized one terrible truth. I wasn't just playing the game anymore. The game was playing me. The message on my phone continued to burn in my mind, its words etched into my thoughts. You can't escape the game. It plays you now. At first, I convinced myself it was just a freaky coincidence, a glitch in my phone or some prank from one of my friends. But deep down, I knew better. Something felt wrong. The game wasn't just a game anymore, and I wasn't merely its player. I was tangled in something far darker, something insidious that was now manipulating my every action, my every thought. I sat in my chair, trying to calm myself. The screen was off, the house around me silent and still. But I could still hear the whispers. The faint murmurs from the game echoed in my ears, soft at first, like a distant memory, but growing louder with each passing second. The phone buzzed again. This time, I hesitated before looking. My heart thudded heavily in my chest, as if warning me to leave it alone. But curiosity, the same thing that had driven me to click on the mysterious game in the first place, compelled me to unlock the screen. A single notification stared back at me. You're invited to play. Again, there was no sender, no phone number. It was just a cryptic message that felt more like a command than an invitation. The words didn't seem to make sense. I had already played the game. How could I play again? What was this invitation? And who was inviting me? My hands trembled as I typed out a response, not sure what I was expecting or hoping for. What do you want from me? I waited for a long time, staring at the screen, my pulse racing. The silence was maddening. But then, the phone buzzed once more. You'll find out soon enough. I stared at the message. There was no answer to my question, just another cryptic reply that sent a chill through me. The whispers grew louder, almost as if the phone itself was somehow alive. It was as though the game was reaching into my world, pulling at the strings of my reality. I stood up abruptly, my chair scraping against the floor as I stumbled back from the desk. The room felt suffocating, the air thick with tension. But the whispers didn't stop. They were in my head now, no longer coming from the phone or the game. They surrounded me, a constant presence, like an invisible force that refused to let me go. I could feel their weight pressing against me, like a hand on my shoulder, guiding me back to the screen. My eyes darted to the desk, where my laptop sat in the dim light. I didn't want to turn it on. I didn't want to go back to the game, but I knew, deep down, that I had no choice. The game had already found its way into my life. I couldn't escape it. Reluctantly, I opened the laptop, my fingers numb with dread. The screen flickered on, the familiar loading screen of the game appearing once again. But this time, something was different. The game didn't start like it had before. There were no options to choose from, no menus to click through. Instead, the screen displayed a message in bold, unsettling text. It's time to play again. You can't escape. You'll never escape. The words burned themselves into my mind, and before I could even process them, the game world loaded. I wasn't in the forest anymore. The familiar dark house was gone, replaced by something else entirely. I stood in an empty room, lit only by a dim, flickering light that hung from the ceiling. The walls were bare, no furniture, no decorations, nothing to indicate what this place was or how I had gotten there. But then I saw at a door, a single, unmarked door at the far end of the room. My character moved toward it as if drawn by some unseen force, and I had no control over it. My hands were frozen on the keyboard, my mind racing with fear and confusion. What was happening? Why couldn't I stop playing? I watched helplessly as the character reached the door. The moment I clicked to open it, the screen flickered, and the whispers in my ears intensified, filling the room with a horrible, unnerving noise. But when the door opened, there was nothing behind it. Just darkness. The room had shifted too. I wasn't standing in a cold, empty space anymore. Now, the walls were closing in around me. The ceiling began to lower, the floor seemed to tilt, and the door was no longer there. In its place was a mirror, reflecting my character's face. But it wasn't just the face of my in-game avatar. It was my own face, twisted, contorted in an expression of fear that I knew wasn't just a part of the game. I didn't understand. It felt wrong. My heart pounded as I watched the reflection of my character's face slowly turn toward the screen. For a split second, I saw my own eyes staring back at me. And then the whispers became words. Clear words. You should have never played. The reflection in the mirror grinned. A wide, sinister grin that didn't belong to me, to the character. It was something else, something alive. The grin stretched impossibly wide, as if the character's face couldn't contain the malicious joy that now twisted it. And then the whisper came again, clearer this time, ringing in my ears. Now you are mine. Before I could react, the screen blinked and the image in the mirror shattered into thousands of pieces. The room was gone, and the familiar forest from earlier reappeared. Only this time, it was different. It felt darker, more oppressive, as if the trees themselves were closing in, suffocating everything in their shadows. My phone buzzed again. I grabbed it, desperately wanting to make sense of what was happening. The screen flashed a new message. You've been chosen. But before I could process it, the phone went black, and the whispers reached a crescendo, deafening and all-encompassing. I could no longer tell where the game ended and my reality began. I had played a game I shouldn't have, and now it was playing me. I sat frozen, staring at the black screen of my phone. The whispers continued to swirl around me, their voices coming from everywhere, as if the very air itself had turned into a cacophony of disembodied sounds. I could feel my breath quicken, my heart racing in my chest, as if it wanted to escape my body. You've been chosen. The words replayed in my mind, echoing through my skull. I had no idea what it meant or why I was part of whatever this twisted game was. All I knew was that I couldn't stop it. There was no escape. The game had somehow crossed over into my life, and now it was controlling everything. I stood up abruptly, my legs weak beneath me. The room felt suffocating, the walls pressing in. My hands were trembling as I reached for the door. I needed to get out. I needed to breathe. But when I grabbed the doorknob, it felt wrong. Cold. Too cold. I yanked my hand back, shuddering. The room was no longer just a room. It had become something else, something unfamiliar. I needed to get outside. The door swung open as if on its own. But the moment I stepped through, I was no longer in my apartment. The familiar world outside had been replaced by an endless stretch of darkness. The ground beneath my feet slick and wet, as though I were standing on the edge of a vast, endless abyss. And then I heard it, the whisper, louder this time, clearer. Run. I turned around to find the door was gone. In its place was nothing but the dark void. Panic surged through me as I realized I had no idea where I was or how I got here. The game, this nightmare, had pulled me into its world, and now there was no turning back. Run, the whisper repeated, and this time I didn't need any further prompting. I began to run, my feet pounding against the wet ground as I tried to escape the all-encompassing blackness. The air was thick, almost suffocating, and the further I ran, the more the whispers seemed to follow, getting louder, closer. The darkness wasn't just a lack of light. It was alive. It shifted and pulsated, moving around me like a living thing. My breath came in ragged gasps, the fear gnawing at my insides. I didn't know what was chasing me, but I knew one thing. If I stopped, if I hesitated even for a second, it would get me. I kept running, faster now, desperate for any sign of hope. I could barely see in the inky blackness, but I thought I saw something ahead, just a flicker of light in the distance. Hope surged through me. Maybe it was an exit. Maybe it was a way out. But as I moved closer, the light began to dim, flickering like a dying flame. The shadows stretched and writhed around it, consuming everything in their path. It was getting closer. Whatever I had been running from was catching up. Suddenly, the ground beneath my feet gave way, and I stumbled forward into nothingness. My body plummeted, the air rushing past me as I fell into an endless abyss, screaming. But before I hit the ground, everything stopped. The falling sensation vanished, and I found myself standing again as though nothing had happened. I was in a new place now, still engulfed in darkness. But this time there was something else. A sound, a scraping noise, slow and deliberate. I turned my head toward it, heart hammering in my chest. In the distance, there was a figure, a shadow among shadows, moving toward me. I couldn't make out its shape, but I could feel its presence, like it was watching me. I took a hesitant step backward, but the figure didn't stop. It moved closer, faster now. My instincts screamed at me to run again, but my legs refused to cooperate. The closer it got, the more I could feel the cold air pressing down on me, the weight of its presence suffocating. "You can't escape." The whisper came from the figure itself. The voice was distorted and human. It was like the game had taken on a form of its own, and now it was coming for me. I had no choice. I had to run. But when I turned to flee, the ground began to shift again. The earth cracked open beneath my feet, and the darkness swallowed everything whole. I fell once more, my body twisting and jerking as I plummeted through the void. This time, there was no escape, no light, no hope. The game had claimed me, and now it was playing me. I awoke with a start, gasping for air as my hands shot out to steady myself. I was back in my room, back in my bed, as if nothing had happened. The sheets were tangled around my body, my heart still racing from the nightmare that had felt all too real. I glanced at the clock. 3:33 a.m. My phone lay on the nightstand beside me, screen cracked, but still glowing faintly. The game was still there, still waiting. I reached for it without thinking, my fingers trembling as I unlocked the screen. A new message blinked at me. "You can't run anymore. The game is not over. It will never be over." I swiped through the screen, ignoring the dread that settled in my stomach. The game wasn't just a game. It was part of me now, and it was playing me. A strange chill began to seep into the room, spreading through the walls and over the floor like a cold fog. At first, Emma had thought it was just a draft, but now she knew better. The game had started to weave itself into the fabric of her reality. The line between the digital and the real had blurred, and she was no longer in control. The screen glowed ominously in the darkened room, casting eerie, flickering shadows against the walls. Emma sat frozen, her eyes locked onto the game's interface. The flashing, cryptic messages now filled the screen with an almost mocking, rhythmic beat. "You should have listened. It's too late now." Emma could feel the air tightening around her chest, a pressure as if something unseen was slowly suffocating her. Sweat dripped down her forehead. She tried to reach for the mouse to quit the game, but her fingers refused to move. It was as if the game had taken hold of her body too, like an invisible chain keeping her in place. Suddenly, the phone rang. The harsh sound pierced the silence like a slap. Emma flinched, her pulse quickening. She didn't want to answer it. She knew, she just knew, it wasn't going to be good. But the ringing persisted, louder, insistent. With shaking hands, she grabbed the phone, her breath shallow. As she brought it to her ear, a voice that she didn't recognize spoke in a hoarse whisper. "You're not alone." The line went dead. Her heart hammered against her chest. The voice was familiar in a way she couldn't quite place, a whisper from the past, a warning that she should have heeded long ago. The fear surged again, overpowering the rational part of her mind. Was it another player, someone who had fallen victim to the game like her? Or was it the game itself, playing tricks with her mind? The game interface on the screen flickered, and the message changed. "Look behind you." Emma whipped around, her heart nearly stopping in her chest. The room was empty. Only the faint hum of the ceiling fan broke the silence. Her mind raced, replaying the voice, the cryptic message. Was it just part of the game? Was she imagining it? She turned back to the screen, but before she could process what she was seeing, the words on the screen shifted again. "Run." That's when the first shadow appeared. It moved across the corner of the room, so quickly that Emma thought she was seeing things. She blinked, but the shadow was still there, growing larger, stretching out from the corner, its form twisting and shifting unnaturally. The darkness began to crawl up the walls, pooling at the edges of the room. Emma's breath caught in her throat. She stood up abruptly, her mind screaming at her to leave, but her legs were frozen. The shadow flickered once, then vanished. Emma looked around frantically, trying to make sense of what was happening. But the game was still on the screen, its messages now more insistent, more desperate. Run! Now! The room seemed to close in on her, the walls pressing in from every side, the suffocating air thick with an unnatural cold. Emma could feel her sanity beginning to fray at the edges. Her fingers trembled as she reached for the power button on her computer. She couldn't take it anymore. It was too much. But just as her finger touched the button, the lights went out. The house plunged into darkness. A terrifying silence followed. Emma stood there, her hands still frozen on the computer, her heart hammering in her chest. Then, something else moved in the dark. She could feel it, something brushing against her skin, cold and slimy, like 1,000 tiny tendrils reaching out. The whispers returned, now louder, more urgent. "Come to me, Emma." The voice was no longer a whisper, but a deep growl, coming from all directions at once, echoing off the walls and into her very bones. Emma screamed, but the sound was swallowed by the darkness. Before she could react, something heavy struck her from behind, throwing her to the floor. Her head hit the hard wooden floor with a sickening thud. Dazed, she tried to get up, but the weight on her back was too much. She twisted, trying to see what was attacking her, but everything was a blur. The whispers grew louder, more insistent, until they became a deafening cacophony. Then, with a sickening jolt, the weight lifted. She gasped, but before she could understand what had happened, the voice came again, this time with a finality that made her blood run cold. "You're not playing anymore." The room flickered. Emma's vision began to blur, and the darkness seemed to close in on her. She couldn't move, couldn't breathe. The world around her felt like it was disintegrating, pulling apart piece by piece. All she could hear was the voice, repeating over and over again, "You're not playing anymore." The silence that followed was suffocating. It wasn't the usual quiet of an empty room. It was a deeper, more oppressive stillness. Emma's breath came in ragged gasps, but it felt like the air itself had thickened, almost as if it was no longer just air, no longer just the world she knew. Her body was frozen, her senses tingling with the pressure of something unseen, something right at the edges of her perception, just out of reach but ever present. It wasn't until she heard the slow, deliberate creak of the floorboards beneath her that she finally snapped out of her daze. The weight on her chest was gone, but she still felt as if she was being held in place by invisible hands. She opened her eyes and realized, with a sharp jolt of fear, that the darkness was no longer just in the room. It was in her mind, creeping into every corner of her thoughts, gnawing at her sanity. She tried to stand, but her legs wouldn't cooperate. Panic set in as the reality of what was happening began to sink in. The game had come to life, had become something far worse than a mere game. She had opened the door to something that had been waiting for her all along, something that had been playing her, pulling her in deeper with each click. A voice, low and guttural, filled the room, but it wasn't coming from the screen. It was coming from behind her, so close that she could feel the hot breath on her neck. "Emma," the voice whispered her name, dragging it out with a horrible emphasis. "You thought you could escape?" Her body went cold, the words sinking into her very bones. The whisper grew louder, filling every inch of the room as if it was closing in on her, pulling her deeper into its grip. "You can't leave. Not now. Not after everything you've done." She struggled to push herself up, her hand groping for something to steady herself, but the floor seemed to sway beneath her. She reached for the desk, but before she could grab it, something grabbed her wrist. Cold, clammy fingers wrapped around her arm, pulling her back. She screamed, the sound tearing through her throat as she tried to wrench herself free. Her fingers dug into the desk, but it was like trying to grab onto smoke. The room around her flickered, the walls shifting, bending, warping. The light from the screen cast long, sinister shadows, the edges of the room distorted into something alien and unnatural. "Don't you get it?" the voice hissed. "You're mine now. You've always been mine." Her breath hitched as the reality of what was happening truly hit her. The game, the whispers, the shadowy presence, it wasn't just playing her anymore. It was taking her. It had found her weakness, her fear, and now it was devouring her from the inside out. The walls trembled, vibrating as if something huge was pushing against them. The computer screen flickered again, and Emma's gaze shot to it. The interface was still open, but now the words had changed. "You don't belong here anymore." With a frantic, trembling hand, Emma reached for the mouse, desperate to shut it off, to end this madness. But before she could click the power button, the screen flashed bright, blinding her for a moment. Then, in an instant, the lights went out, plunging her into total darkness. Click! Her heart stopped. A loud click echoed in the silent room, followed by the unmistakable sound of the computer powering on again. The screen flickered back to life, but this time, it wasn't the game that greeted her. It was her face. Her reflection stared back at her from the screen, but it wasn't right. There was something twisted about it. Her eyes were hollow, dark and empty, like someone had drained the life from them. Her mouth was stretched into a grotesque smile, one that wasn't her own. The reflection shifted, as if it were alive, grinning wider as it moved. It spoke. "I'm you now," Emma screamed, but the reflection didn't stop. It was mocking her, taunting her. The smile on her face was no longer her own. It twisted into something monstrous, something far darker than she had ever known. The reflection's eyes glowed, burning into hers, and she felt a chill crawl up her spine. She stumbled backward, away from the screen, but the room around her seemed to distort. The walls seemed to stretch and bend, and the floor tilted beneath her. The shadows were alive, crawling across the floor like living things, reaching out for her, pulling at her legs, trying to drag her back into the depths of the nightmare. "No," Emma gasped, shaking her head. "This can't be real." But the whispers in the dark had already started again. "They can't hear you, Emma. They'll never save you. You're mine now." She felt the weight of the words settle over her like a curse. The game had claimed her, and now there was no escape. The reflection on the screen mocked her, every movement, every motion, as if it was her body, her mind, being twisted into something else. "Stop!" she shouted, her voice cracking. "Please stop. I don't want this." The reflection's smile widened, and then it stepped out of the screen. Her blood ran cold. The thing that had been her reflection now stood in the room with her, an impossible, distorted version of herself. Its face was a grotesque mask, its eyes hollow and empty, its grin stretching unnaturally wide, like a clown's smile carved into the skin. Emma backed away, unable to look away from the thing that was now standing where she had just been. It wasn't her. Not anymore. This was something far worse. Something that had been born from her fear, from her mistakes, from the very game she had foolishly played. "You've made a mistake," the thing said in her voice, but it wasn't hers anymore. "You belong to me." The room trembled as the walls seemed to close in, and the darkness thickened around her. The game wasn't over. It had only just begun. The screen flickered again, and in the glow of its light, Emma saw something that froze her blood. The words on the screen changed again. Level complete, but Emma knew better now. She was never going to escape. The game had taken her, and it was just getting started. The whispers returned, louder this time, curling around Emma like a suffocating fog. The distorted version of herself stood motionless in the corner, its twisted grin never wavering, its eyes hollow and dark as it watched her every move. She could hear its thoughts, the dark, relentless pulse of its presence, an unnatural hum that made her insides churn. Level complete. The words echoed in her mind, a cruel reminder of how far she had fallen into the game's clutches. It wasn't over. She realized that now. It had never been over. It had always been a trap, and she had stepped right into it. Emma's legs felt heavy, as if the air itself was pressing down on her, forcing her to stay in place. Her skin prickled with a cold sweat as the walls around her seemed to close in, the shadows multiplying, stretching, and warping in ways that defied logic. The room was no longer the one she knew. The familiar corners had disappeared, replaced by an oppressive, black void that consumed everything. The thing that had once been her reflection took a step forward, its hollow eyes tracking her every movement. Emma's breath hitched as she backed away, her pulse pounding in her ears. "You're mine now," it repeated in her voice, each word laced with venom. "And you're gonna play forever. There's no turning back." Emma turned her gaze to the screen once more. The interface had changed again, the words morphing as if they had a life of their own. "Welcome to your new game." Her chest tightened with fear. The game had never been just a game. It was a conduit, a doorway, a portal to something darker. She had known that the moment she first clicked play, it had been waiting for her, watching her. Each decision, each action had led her down this path. She forced herself to focus. Panic was not going to help her now. She needed to think. There had to be something she could do. The rules of the game might have changed, but there had to be a way out. If she could just make the right move, outsmart the thing in front of her, she might. A cold gust of wind blew through the room, extinguishing the dim light from the screen. Darkness swallowed her whole. She staggered, reaching out for anything to steady herself. Her heart raced as she felt the room shift once more, the boundaries between reality and nightmare thinning to a point where she could barely tell where one ended and the other began. Suddenly, her reflection, spoke again, its voice low and slithering. "Don't you remember? You've already played. You've already lost." Emma's eyes widened in terror. Her mind raced. What did it mean by that? The shadows in the room seemed to pulse and move, as if alive, slithering towards her in waves. Her breath caught in her throat as a shape began to emerge from the darkness, its outline shifting with every passing second. It was tall, unnaturally tall, and its presence filled the room like a suffocating force. "Everything you thought you knew," the creature said, "was just a lie. It's all part of the game. You are the game, and now you will play until there's nothing left of you." Emma's legs shook beneath her, but she refused to let herself fall. She refused to give in. The creature's voice was a constant hum in her mind, its words wrapping around her thoughts like chains. It was trying to break her, trying to turn her into something else, something that wasn't human. The floor beneath her feet trembled, and a sickening sensation crept up her spine. The walls closed in once more, the darkness pressing against her like 1,000 invisible hands. Her stomach twisted, nausea threatening to take over. The game wasn't just in the computer anymore. It had spread throughout her world, seeped into the very fabric of her existence. Emma closed her eyes, blocking out the overwhelming weight of it all. She couldn't afford to let fear take over. She had to keep fighting. When she opened her eyes again, the screen flickered back to life, bathing the room in an eerie glow. The words had changed once again, now forming a cruel sentence that made Emma's heart stop. "You will never win. The game will never end." The words seemed to mock her, to laugh at her futile attempts to escape. Her pulse quickened, and she realized something terrifying. There was no way out. The game had become her reality, and now it was playing her. The twisted version of her reflection reached out a hand, its fingers elongating unnaturally. The touch was cold, colder than anything Emma had ever felt. The hand moved toward her face, and before she could react, it pressed against her skin. A shock of ice shot through her body, freezing her in place. The world around her seemed to slow as her senses dulled. The thing that had once been her reflection smiled, its grin widening grotesquely. "Do you feel it? This is the end. This is where the game begins." Emma tried to scream, but no sound came. She couldn't move. She couldn't breathe. The pressure in her chest was unbearable, like the entire weight of the game was collapsing on top of her. And then, in a moment of clarity, Emma realized the horrible truth. She wasn't trapped in a game anymore. She was the game. The thing that had once been her reflection opened its mouth wide, its face distorting further, revealing sharp, jagged teeth. The darkness that had enveloped the room now consumed her entire being, pulling her into its void. The whispers surrounded her, growing louder, deafening, as the game that had taken hold of her life tightened its grip. As the darkness swallowed her whole, the last thing Emma heard was the final whisper, one last word that sealed her fate. Play. The game had become more than just a distraction. It was now a force in my life, driving everything I did, warping my thoughts, controlling my actions. Every time I thought I could break free, I felt the weight of its presence, an invisible hand tightening around my throat. It had already taken everything, my time, my sleep, my relationships, and now it wanted my soul. I'd stopped answering the phone, ignoring the knocks at the door, avoiding mirrors and windows. There was no escape. I knew the game was watching me, tracking every move I made. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw it. When I woke, it was still there, lurking just out of sight, waiting for me to slip up. Then came the whispers. You can't hide forever. It was faint at first, just a shadow of a voice creeping into my consciousness. But soon, it became louder, clearer. It was no longer just in my mind. It was in my apartment, echoing off the walls, bouncing off the ceiling. I couldn't ignore it. The game had spoken, and now it was closing in. Part 9, Descent into Madness. I couldn't stop myself from playing anymore. Every time I sat down, every time I glanced at the glowing screen, I felt an irresistible pull. It was as though the game had learned my fears, my desires, and it used them against me. The more I played, the more real the world inside the game became, and the more distorted reality around me grew. It wasn't long before the lines between the game and the real world began to blur. I saw the characters walking behind me when I wasn't playing, their shadows moving across my walls when the lights were out. The air in the room felt heavy, thick with malice, as though the game itself had bled into my world, a dark energy seeping through the cracks. My friends, what little remained of them, were becoming concerned. They'd stopped visiting, stopped calling. I had become a ghost in my own life. The whispers had only grown stronger, louder, filling my head with demands, with orders to continue playing, to keep moving forward. And I couldn't say no. Part 10, the final move. One night it happened. The game reached its final stage. It didn't just ask for my soul, it demanded it. The screen flashed, bright and blinding, casting strange reflections in the room. A message appeared, but it wasn't on the screen. It was in my mind, clearer than anything I had ever experienced. I could feel its presence everywhere. The game is over, but the real game is about to begin. The room felt colder. The walls seemed to shift and ripple like water, distorting everything in sight. I tried to move, to scream, but I couldn't. I was frozen in place, my body no longer my own. The game had completed its cycle, and now it was time for me to become a part of it. As the final image on the screen glitched, I saw something that shook me to my core. My reflection staring back at me, but it wasn't mine. It was the version of me from inside the game, hollow-eyed, grinning maliciously. And then, the smile stretched impossibly wide, splitting the screen, and everything went black. In that instant, I was pulled into the game. It wasn't just a simulation anymore. It was real, and I was trapped within it. But as I realized that there was no way out, I knew something worse than the game itself had begun. The whispers hadn't stopped. They were all around me now, in the darkness of my mind and the recesses of the game's world, pulling me deeper. And now, it was my turn to play.